So I'm going back to the beginning because I need time to clip. So I'm going to start. It's about 19 minutes.
Expectation of a very distinct starting line.
Right, like a track meet or something.
Yeah, exactly. We picture this scenario where a child turns 5 years old, they get a little backpack, they walk into a kindergarten classroom, and then the starting gun fires.
And that is supposedly when the learning actually begins.
Right.
It creates a really clean chronological timeline for us. I mean, it allows us to measure development neatly, basically separating a person's life into school time and, not school time.
But if you step into the realm of intergenerational cultural transmission, that neat little starting line just completely vanishes.
It really does.
We are looking at a landscape today where education starts generations before a child is even conceived.
Which is wild because it forces us to fundamentally rethink what we even define as a school or a classroom.
Exactly. So today's deep dive is exploring a really profound question. What if education doesn't start on the first day of kindergarten, but long before you even exist? And what if the traditional schooling system isn't designed to unlock your inherent genius, but is actually structured merely to produce an obedient citizen?
To investigate this, we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources centered specifically on African-centered educational excellence.
Right. We have a few different things here.
Yeah, we have a working document outlining the educational vision of Dr. Adora Obi-Nwise. And this is dated April 29, 2026.
Okay.
And we are pairing that with a detailed framework from Kemetic Africologist Jimamot Dogan McWilson, which maps out these continuous stages of human socialization.
And a quick note for you, the listener, before we really wade into the deep end of this material today.
Yeah, this is important.
These sources contain some uncompromising critiques of government institutions, and they advocate for highly specific cultural frameworks.
Very specific.
Right. Our goal today is not to endorse or take sides on these political viewpoints. We are simply here to impartially unpack the really fascinating psychological concepts and the alternative educational models presented by these authors.
Exactly. We are basically dissecting the architecture of their arguments.
Exactly that. So we will be tracing this learning journey from early pre-womb conditioning all the way to a proposed academic ecosystem that actually transforms sports into science labs.
Which I can't wait to get into.
Same. And it shifts the entire purpose of education from mere survival to actual genius development.
So if we start where McWilson's framework starts, we have to look far before a classroom door ever opens.
Right.
We have to look before biology is even a factor. He identifies the very first phase of learning as the pre-womb stage.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second.
Yeah.
Because calling something pre-womb education is a pretty major conceptual leap. How does a child learn anything before they physically exist?
Well, McWilson frames this as intergenerational influence. The argument is that before a child is even a thought, the future mother and father are being aggressively shaped by the cultural, social, and psychological legacies of their community.
Oh, I see.
Right, the community is constantly transmitting specific value systems. The text points to Ma'at and Dahotep values, for instance.
Let me just jump in with some context there. Ma'at represents ancient Egyptian concepts of truth, balance, order, and justice.
Right.
While Pa'tep refers to ancient wisdom literature that focuses on morality and social behavior.
Yeah.
Just so we have that baseline.
That's a great clarification. So when a community continuously reinforces those specific narratives, reading cultures, and origin stories, it creates what sociologists call anticipatory socialization.
Anticipatory socialization. Okay.
Yeah. A future mother is basically internalizing her societal role, her understanding of justice, and her worldview long before conception.
Wow.
And that internalized worldview eventually becomes the very environment the future child will be born into.
So it's like a software operating system being coded before the computer hardware is even fully assembled.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
The family's history, their values, maybe their intergenerational trauma, and their triumphs that constitutes the baseline code.
And that analogy holds up especially well when we transition to the actual physical assembly of the hardware.
Right, the next stage.
Exactly, which McWilson categorizes as the womb phase of schooling, the biological imprinting.
Because we generally think of a fetus just growing physically, right? Like limbs and organs.
Yeah, just biology.
But the research cited here delves heavily into epigenetics.
Mm-hmm.
The mother's environment is directly wiring fetal neurodevelopment.
It's incredible.
If she is experiencing chronic stress, high anxiety, or on the flip side, deep joy, Her body is sending hormonal and biochemical signals straight to the fetus.
like cortisol or endorphins.
Exactly.
So it is actively shaping the child's nervous system. McWilson's adult and professional analysis notes that this prenatal programming influences early brain development, emotional regulation, and even attachment tendencies.
And it isn't just chemical either.
No, not at all.
The text points out early exposure to sound and language, the rhythms of the environment, affirmations, music, the cadence of the mother's voice.
The fetus is perceiving all of these inputs and becoming familiar with them.
So the biological hardware is already running the cultural software before the child takes their first breath.
Which seamlessly moves us into the living room.
Yeah.
Because once the child is born, parents take on the role of the first master teachers.
Master teachers. That is a very deliberate phrasing in the framework.
It really is.
Parents aren't just caregivers. They are primary agents of socialization. They encode the fundamental cultural schema.
Right. Through everyday discipline and emotional caregiving, they establish what is acceptable and what is taboo.
They are teaching language, behavior, and study habits.
But more critically, the text emphasizes that they are teaching our story.
Our story.
Yeah, which is a very intentional pivot away from traditional history.
Oh, interesting.
They are instilling a narrative of achievement and success from an African-centered perspective rather than an external Eurocentric one.
So the child has this incredibly tight, intimate circle of influence.
Very insulated.
Right. We have the pre-womb intergenerational coding, the biological imprinting in the womb, and the foundational schema built by the parents.
But inevitably, that circle has to widen. The child has to interact with a broader world.
And the framework maps this expansion out through extended networks, right?
Yeah, specifically fathers and male mentors, the broader family unit, and eventually the community.
Let's look at the male mentorship aspect for a second because the text highlights that specifically.
It does.
The focus here seems heavily geared toward teaching courage, protection, problem solving, and safety for sisters. It feels distinct from general parenting.
It is distinct because it involves the transmission of very specific gendered cultural scripts.
Okay.
Fathers and male mentors introduce the child to societal expectations of manhood and community protection.
Right.
They are setting boundaries and teaching children how to navigate risk and authority. It provides a unique layer of identity formation that basically complements the primary caregiving.
And then the lens zooms out again to the extended kinship network, the family school.
Right, the gatherings.
Yeah, we're talking about gatherings, interactions with elders, and sibling dynamics. Sibling interactions are actually fascinating here.
Oh, for sure.
Because the text frames them as a sort of microeconomy of knowledge.
Think about the mechanics of sibling conflict.
Yeah.
When siblings argue over a toy or space, they aren't just fighting. They are in a controlled laboratory learning negotiation, compromise, and the limits of social transgression.
Wow, yeah. They are developing real-time conflict resolution skills entirely outside of parental dictation.
Exactly. And alongside that, you have the elders transmitting folklore.
Right.
An elder telling a story isn't just entertaining a child. They are embedding complex metaphors and intergenerational wisdom that a child's brain uses to categorize the whole world,
It reinforces a continuous cultural loop.
which scales up massively once the child reaches the community level.
The next stage.
Yeah. The text details the introduction of Saturday academies, study circles, STEM programs, and achievement awards.
Oh.
This is where peer influence becomes a dominant force, and civic responsibility is formally introduced.
So what does this all mean? Like, when I look at this continuous journey from intergenerational pre-womb values to a community teaching STEM and African-centered arcs, I have to ask a structural question.
Okay.
Are these interconnected networks meant to insulate the child from the outside world? Or are they providing a specific type of armor before the child steps out into it?
That's a great question. The text leans heavily into the concept of armoring.
Armoring, okay.
To explain the mechanism, the author actually references Pierre Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital.
Right, sociology.
Yeah. These community networks are transmitting rituals, language, and shared values that act as a profound psychological resource.
Could you expand on how, say, a Saturday academy actually builds that cultural capital?
Sure. Imagine a child learning mathematics, but the problems and examples are rooted in their own culture's historical architecture or economic models.
Okay, I see.
The child isn't just memorizing formulas. They are internalizing the belief that their ancestors were mathematicians.
Wow.
That becomes an unshakable psychological anchor. They know exactly who they are and what they are capable of. completely independent of external validation.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because we've just spent years building this incredibly rich, highly tailored cultural foundation.
Layer upon layer.
Right. And then, according to the framework, the child hits the government indoctrination school.
The ultimate collision point.
The language McWilson uses is incredibly stark. State institutions, what we normally call public schools, are not framed as environments of human development.
No, they are described as state cultural projects.
Wow.
The argument is that the state uses official curriculums, history, language, social studies to embed national identity and values that serve the state's interests, not necessarily the individual students.
So the underlying goal, according to this framework, isn't to create brilliant free thinkers. It's to produce compliant citizens. The state is essentially telling you what to think, and standardized testing is just the mechanism used to measure how well you've absorbed the approved narrative.
The source states that these environments enforce national mythologies, explicitly noting that history is written by the victors.
Oh, absolutely.
And even the physical structure of traditional schooling bells ringing to signal movement, sitting in rigid rows, requiring permission to speak at all conditions, compliance with authority.
Is highly controlled.
Very. The stated outcome is to render populations literate enough to function, but shaped to maintain the state's order.
I really want to look at the psychological friction here.
Yeah, it's intense.
If a child has been deeply immersed in an African-centered worldview, if they've been taught our story, if their extended family has affirmed their natural genius, what happens to their brain when they suddenly enter an environment that demands they conform to a standardized state narrative?
Right.
That seems like a fundamental clash of operating systems.
It creates an intense cognitive dissonance. The expert analysis within the text highlights a massive crisis of identity and power relations.
I can imagine.
The spate system is essentially asking the child to unlearn or compartmentalize the very cultural capital their family and community just spent years meticulously building.
Because if a child knows the complex truth of their history from their elders, but they are being graded and tested on a simplified, victor-centric version of history, they have to choose between their cultural truth and academic survival.
Precisely. And this severe friction is why the text argues that true mind-liberated success requires an individual to be socialized within their own culture.
Right.
It is the catalyst for why entirely new educational ecosystems are being designed to bypass that government standardization completely.
Because if that friction with standardized schooling is so damaging, educators are designing entirely new ecosystems.
Exactly.
And that brings us to Dr. Adora Obi-Nmizi's working document.
Yes, the April 2026 document.
Right. If government schools are built to standardize, Dr. Nmizi's model is built to completely individualize.
She proposes a holistic, best academic practice model designed specifically for Black student achievement.
And the central pillar of her vision is an idea called the genius of Black children,
which requires a massive paradigm shift.
How so?
Well, traditional education heavily relies on deficit thinking. When a student struggles, the system asks, what is broken in this child and what remediation is required to bring them up to the state baseline?
Right, fixing the broken parts.
Exactly. But Dr. Nmizi's model demands asset-based thinking.
Oh, so the assumption changes.
Yes.
The model assumes the child is already naturally gifted, highly intelligent, and creative. The responsibility shifts to the adults to build an environment that actually utilizes that genius.
The text notes that children at ages 4 and 5 are naturally acting as scientists, mathematicians, engineers, and storytellers.
They already have it.
Right. Education shouldn't be about fixing them. It should be about protecting that inherent curiosity.
Let me offer an analogy here because we've all heard that cliche about judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree.
Right.
But I think it's deeper than that. Forcing a culturally grounded, highly kinetic child into a rigid, standardized desk environment is like pouring diesel fuel into a high-performance electric engine.
Oh, I like that.
The engine isn't broken. It doesn't need remediation. The environment is simply forcing entirely incompatible inputs into a very distinct architecture.
That perfectly captures the mechanics of Theme 4 in Dr. Noways' document, which is kinesthetic and tactile learning.
The document explicitly states movement, IS intelligence.
Which is huge. Traditional models often pathologize movement.
Yeah, they do.
If a child is fidgeting or wants to stand, they are immediately labeled a distraction. but Dr. Noyes' framework acknowledges the biological reality of how many brains encode memory.
Right.
Touching, building, pacing, and role-playing physically wire information into the brain. Movement isn't a break from the learning process. The movement is the mechanism of learning.
Which ties directly into theme 7. This part fascinated me because it reframes something we usually view purely as entertainment.
Sports.
Exactly. Theme 7 focuses on analysis and predictive thinking, and it argues that sports and games are actually academic laboratories.
We tend to separate physical play from critical thinking,
Right.
but when students are engaged in sports competitions, they are performing incredibly complex cognitive tasks. They are analyzing the strategies of winners and losers, interpreting real-time data, and understanding cause and effect.
Let's visualize the mechanics of that.
Okay.
If a point guard is driving toward the basket on a basketball court, they aren't just running.
No, absolutely not.
They are actively calculating the velocity of the approaching defender, the geometric angle of the backboard, and the probability of a teammate getting open in the corner.
All at once.
They're doing rapid-fire data interpretation and probability logic in literally milliseconds.
It's math in motion.
Exactly. Dr. Nuise's model takes that innate engagement and leverages it to strengthen math, reading comprehension, and scientific reasoning right in the classroom.
And that high level of engagement is only really possible when you implement Theme 9 from the text, which is asking students about their choices.
Transforming the student from a passive receiver to an active participant.
Right. In traditional environments, the state dictates what will be learned, on what day, and through what exact method.
Very rigid.
Extremely. Dr. Mises' framework requires educators to interrogate the students themselves. What are your interests? How do you feel you learn best?
It grants them agency.
Exactly.
When we look at all 9 of Dr. Nuise's themes working together, it really forms a cohesive ecosystem.
It does.
You have an environment that assumes a child's intelligence, teaches them through multiple sensory pathways, validates their physical movement, and gives them real ownership of their outcomes.
It culminates in a powerful operating principle outlined in the document. The education of Black children must transition from surviving a system to developing genius within their own cultural context.
What an incredible scope we've covered today.
Seriously, it's a lot to process.
We began by completely erasing the kindergarten starting line, looking at how the values, stories, and triumphs of past generations literally code the developmental software of a child before conception.
Then we examined the biological imprinting in the womb and tracked how parents, mentors, and elders strategically armor a child with cultural capital.
We analyzed the profound cognitive dissonance that occurs when that deeply rooted cultural identity crashes into a state system built for standardized compliance.
The friction.
Right. And finally, we explored an active, genius-focused educational ecosystem that views movement as intelligence and places the student firmly in the driver's seat of their own learning.
You know, analyzing these frameworks really forces you to step back and reevaluate your own foundational development.
It really does. And I'd love for you, the listener, to do exactly that. Think about your own stages of socialization.
Yeah.
What specific biases, what methods of conflict resolution, or what origin stories were coded into you by your family and neighborhood long before you ever sat at a standardized desk.
Who was writing your initial operating system?
Right. Who wrote that code?
It is a vital question for understanding how we perceive the entire world today.
And building on that, I want to leave you with one final thought to explore on your own.
Okay.
We discussed the remarkable reality of epigenetic and pre-womb programming, how maternal environments, stress, and societal narratives biologically imprint on the next generation before they are even born.
Right, the womb stage.
If we know that is physically true, how might our modern stressors be unconsciously writing the pre-womb curriculum right now?
Oh, wow.
When we consider our relentless digital connectivity, the 24/7 news cycle, and the algorithm-driven anxieties we carry in our pockets every single day. How are those invisible forces biologically shaping the neurological hardware of children who won't even be born for another 20 years?
That is a staggering implication to consider.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Fallout from the third alleged assassination attempt of...
So part of what you just saw is the integration between what Melissa Asante has talked about in African-centered education, but how do we get it down to the 6 schools, how that's going to work? How do we start talking about Amos Wilson's The Genius of Black Children, and how all of that's going to move together. So if we, in terms of what the campaign is going to be about, the second part, which will be doing tomorrow, I will give you a sample of what that looks like in terms of how we move forward in putting it into practice, and also things that we can get to people because they'll be recorded and they can sit and listen to it the same way we did the playlist before. So I'm just going to bring this up, then I'll stop the recording so that it'll make it my job easier tonight, which I'm excited about. So this is where we'll start tomorrow. This is May 1st, of course, today. The first part is basically how we've integrated African-centered education currently at the level that we can help people understand it and they can listen to it, and how that leads into the cognitive dissonance that people have that our children can't do, but without understanding that that's all built in. So the next part on the slide will be have to do with how do we get here? And there's a revolutionary mind-altering experience that this team will have to have because some of it you've seen before, but because most of our issues are made by humans, how do we start before there were humans, right? Before there were humans, how did we get to be where we are? And it's difficult for people to understand that we were divinely created without speaking to religion. The divine creation began in the beginning before there was religion. And until we accept the fact that our children are divinely created by a divine creator, then they're always put into these subordinate, submissive, inferior positions. So anyway, I just wanted to give you kind of an idea of what we'll do in part 2 tomorrow, which will be a full PowerPoint, which I will send you tomorrow night when we're done in a recording, so you can go back through it. And then there are times when you go back through these things, there are things that you will think about is, okay, how do we make these better? And the whole idea is, if we're going to spread this across the country, we have to have this kind of material so that we don't spend all of our time trying to explain to everyone when in fact they can go into the podcast, they can go into the PowerPoint and start that self-determination by self-teaching, which is not waiting for the government school to start for their children. Anyway,